You ready? Ready! Then let the show begin.
It's time for the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, back with another episode of your favorite PowerShell weekly podcast. And today on the pre-show, we have some pretty cool blogs and projects to share, starting off with a fantastic blog post by none other than the deadly dog himself, Dan Schroeder, multiple ways to set up your CI/CD pipelines and GitHub Actions. Pretty extensive blog post, definitely worth checking out. And he really knows his stuff about GitHub Actions. I'll say that. There's also a audit Microsoft 365 admin activity using PowerShell blog by O365 reports, which is a pretty helpful PowerShell for Microsoft 365 customers. Some commands you can run to get some insights, pretty easy if you're in that ecosystem. A cool project from Jordan Borian, which is PSETW, a PowerShell module for capturing ETW events in real time. That's event tracing for Windows. And just in general, want to plug all of the projects on github.com/deadlydog. Our guest of the day, joining us from Canada, Dan Schroeder. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm psyched to be here. So,
I'm glad to hear that. I've seen you around. I know you've been listening for a while. I've seen some comments on some things, so it's exciting to have a listener on, get to know you. I haven't met you before. It's kind of our first time.
Yeah, it's awesome meeting you like face to face, even though it's online, right? I honestly, I can say I've listened to every single episode of the podcast.
Really?
I started, in the summer of last year. I had a sabbatical with my work. I was lucky enough to get that, and just looking for, something to listen to while I walked the dogs. And so every day I was listening to a new episode of the PowerShell podcast. And yeah, it's great. I love what you do and for the community and for everything. Yeah.
That's great to hear. We're definitely going to cover sort of that journey and maybe some of the messages we shared on the podcast that resonated with you and led to some cool stuff. But first, and in this interview, we're going to cover a bunch of stuff. We're going to cover some of your modules. We're going to cover how you as a developer with over 2 decades of experience, how PowerShell fits into your picture, your perspective in the DevOps SRE platform engineering world, maybe get the take on how things are currently. PowerShell Summit's coming up. Maybe you have a talk. We'll cover that as well and more. But to get started off with, what is this tips module? I've been playing around with it. It's pretty cool. I saw you did some blog posts about it as well. What is this module?
Yeah, so the tips module, I made it last summer. Again, listening to your podcast is actually what inspired me to do it. I had that free time on my sabbatical. Like, I want to do some sort of personal project. What should I do? And in general, I just love helping people, creating videos or blog posts, just to help other developers, help people learn. That's really what I'm passionate about, that and automating things. And so I thought, yeah, let's create a PowerShell module to help people learn PowerShell. And so what it is, you just install the module on your machine, and then you can have it every day. You can have it give you a new PowerShell tip. So it could be something about, maybe a VS Code setting that will make you more productive with PowerShell, something about the syntax, maybe things, like if you're doing a null check, you should have, if, instead of saying if variable X equals null, you should have the null on the left and say if null equals X, that type of thing. Yeah, there's just lots of tips that I've found useful, that I thought other people, especially learning PowerShell, would find useful. But even myself, I've been using PowerShell since, 2012. It was right when it was transitioning. PowerShell 3 had just come out. That's when I got into PowerShell. And I've been, learning things along the way. But even through all that time, I'm still learning stuff all the time, new stuff that, not only the new stuff that's in PowerShell 7, but even stuff that was just old that I hadn't known about. And so that's what this module is really for. It's just to, give people those quick tips and everything on how to, just use PowerShell better, more effectively, be more productive with it. Yeah, and so it has commands. You can say get dash PowerShell tip. It'll give you a PowerShell tip on demand. If you want, you can set it to automatically show a PowerShell tip every time you open your PowerShell prompt. Or like I said, you can set it up to give you a new tip daily or weekly. And so, if you have it showing you a new tip every time you start your prompt, it might be a little intrusive, right? So some people might just want to learn one new thing a week. It's a nice, easy, relaxed, slower pace just to learn new tips without you having to explicitly go out and look for new things, right? They come to you instead of you having to go find them.
Exactly. And one thing you've probably heard us say on the podcast before is, recommending people check out, maybe add this to your profile, get a random help article or this and that. And this sort of is like that, but improved a little bit and more organized, I would say. It's still good to read help topics, but from what I've seen these tips, it's often kind of highlighting a feature or something like that and giving you some links to follow up on it that is actually pretty helpful. I got some stuff about the new operators in PowerShell 7 that I'm not taking full advantage of. So definitely a cool module for people of all different skill levels. You will learn something cool there. And check out the project. I think you have some good resources if people are interested in contributing and kind of getting started. Maybe this is their entry point into their first contribution.
Yeah, for sure. It's all open source on GitHub. So it's all free and everything. I have a video showing how you can contribute to the project. So you don't even need to clone it to your local machine if you don't want. You can just use GitHub code spaces, and that's what the video shows how to do. Open it up in GitHub code spaces, contribute your tip, open the pull request. It goes through the whole flow on how to do that. And you mentioned too, just like a lot of the tips, I'll again, another shout out to the podcast, the PowerShell podcast. A lot of the tips that are in there are stuff while I was listening to the podcast on my walk, I would be like, oh, I didn't know that. That's a really good tip. Or, oh, I got to check that module out. So I just pull out my phone, make a quick little note. And then that's the stuff that's been ending up in the PowerShell tips module. But yes, thank you. I would love more people to contribute to that. I don't want it to just be Dan's PowerShell tips. It's really built and meant to be a community thing. And I was actually super surprised. When I originally made the module, I hadn't tweeted about it or advertised it or anything at all. And I actually had 2 people open up pull requests to submit tips. And I was like, whoa, wow, that's pretty awesome. Since then, though, I haven't had so many. And so I'm really hoping, people listening to the podcast can go check out the tips module and contribute to it, because there's, everybody has their own take on things and things that they find maybe important or helpful that other people might not. And so I don't want it to be just my perspective. I want it to be the community at large. So, yeah.
That is very exciting. I'm blushing over here. I didn't know that I was kind of setting myself up to be like, oh, I heard about it on the PowerShell podcast. But no, this is really cool. I'm glad, kind of disappointed in myself for not plugging this sooner, given that, the kind of origins of it all. But I'm glad we have a nice highlight here. And if you do contribute to this, hit us up at PowerShell@pdq.com and we'll send some swag your way to incentivize a little bit of extra open source contribution out here. But yeah, add it to your profile. You can install it really quickly. There's even a command to add importing the module to your profile and some other helpful commands there. So check it out. There's even a blog on the topic on your blog, which is blog.danskingdom.com, which I will also have a link to in the show notes. So when did you start blogging? Is that a new thing? I want to hear about this story.
Yeah, sure. So I've been writing software for over 20 years. I went to university here in Regina, Saskatchewan. That's where I'm from, up in Canada. And I graduated with my master's in 2009. And then I got my full-time job at my company I'm still at. It's called IQ Metrics. So I've been there about 15 years now. And I started blogging, a couple of years after I started there. And originally I was just blogging on an internal company blog that I started. But I thought, I'm like, all the stuff that I'm writing, it's not really specific to my company. Anybody could benefit from this. And so that was back in around 2010. And I think it was 2011 is when I decided, I'm going to start writing stuff on my own personal blog. So I opened up a blog for free on geekswithblogs.net, I believe is what it used to be called. I'm not sure if they're still around or not. And so I blogged there for a couple of years. I wasn't super happy with that platform. It was really good, and especially just for getting started. But shortly after, I wanted some things like I couldn't see, view stats and all these other things that I wanted to know. And so I moved over to WordPress around 2013 or 2014, something like that. And it was just hosted with GoDaddy. It was nice and simple, at least at first. And that was cool because you got all these plugins that'll give you metrics and stuff. And you can see, your top favorited posts and all these cool things. But then a few years down the road, WordPress is updated all the time. And I found there is like an automatically update WordPress button to get all the security fixes. But I found it worked maybe 50% of the time. And the other times it would just break and I couldn't update. And then I'd be manually like downloading the source code files and having to FTP them over to get updated to the latest version. It just was not a good experience. And the other thing also is there's an excellent blogger, YouTuber, TikToker, everything that you might know it for the .NET platform or just for Microsoft called Scott Hanselman. So you might know of Scott Hanselman. He's a kind of a pretty big deal in the Microsoft world. But one of his things was, you want to make sure you own your content. And so, getting started, if you're just getting started with a blog, I would say go to something like dev.to or something where it's just easy to get up and running quickly. But if you don't, if that website goes out of business or they go away, you don't necessarily have your content anymore, right? All that, blood, sweat, and tears that you put into making those posts are now just gone. That sort of along with just how much of a headache it was updating WordPress all the time had me move over to just now I use GitHub Pages, which is completely free, with Jekyll, which basically I write all my posts in Markdown, it converts it to HTML, and then it's hosted on GitHub Pages for free. And so that way everything's in Git. It's under source control. It's all version control. They can roll back really easy if I need to. Hooking up comments was a little bit tougher. I had to use something called Static Man, but all that information is actually on my blog as well. So again, my blog itself is open source on GitHub. If you want to see how it works, you can actually go there. And I have, a README for myself about like what I did to get there and all the customizations I've made. But it's also super helpful for other people if they're wondering, how did he do that? What exactly did he change? The commit history is all in Git, which is awesome. But yeah, that's sort of, how I got to where I am with my blog today. But really, though, I do blog mostly, I do blog to help people, but it's also for myself. Because a lot of the times, you wouldn't believe how many times you go blogging or go searching for something on the internet, and then you find an answer or a blog post that you wrote years ago, and you're like, oh, I totally forgot about that. That's right. And it's kind of a running joke at my office as well, is lots of people, they're doing the same thing, right? They're just searching for some problem, trying to solve it, and they run across my blog or an answer I put on Stack Overflow, and they shoot me a message on Slack being like, hey, Dan, look what I found today. And so, I wouldn't say blog for others. I do it for myself, at least. For me, blogging is just something that I like to do. I'm passionate about it. I like sharing my journey and what I've learned with other people. And then, like I said, also I come back around because I can't remember what I did 6 months ago sometimes. And so if you blog about it, you might have to come back to it in a year and you have your steps to do it. It's
just one of those things where it's the right choice any way you look at it, pretty much, especially if you don't put too much pressure on yourself to actually do it. If you're just documenting kind of what you're doing, making it for yourself and presenting it in a way, you have the benefit of being able to use that one bit of effort for yourself in the future, but also who knows who it helps and who it perhaps inspires to start their own blog, and then goes down the chain. And it's definitely the right thing to do. And GitHub Pages is a fantastic way to start. It's a great way to get experience with GitHub as well, and kind of PRs and all that in a safe way where you get an interactive element or you get your web page at the end, something kind of cool to reward your efforts of figuring out how to use GitHub Pages, which isn't too challenging.
Yeah, I love what you called out there is just make it low stress, low pressure. That's the key thing, right? My first few blog posts, they were all 1 minute reads, just really quick stuff, right? Just a quick note for myself, essentially. I'm just writing this down, throwing it somewhere. Hey, it just happens to be out in the public forum. So, which is awesome. I still do a lot of those from time to time, but sometimes I also do have longer blog posts. I think my last one I started just before Halloween, and I just wrapped it up this weekend. So it was a 2-month long thing. So don't put pressure and stress on yourself. You don't need to do that. It can just be a quick, 5-10 minute thing that you just jot off and just have it out there because other people will find it useful.
Exactly. Make it easy for yourself. Don't make it too challenging. And once you get in the flow of things, you can take off more, but it's like building that brick wall, just one brick at a time, one small challenge, and you'll do some pretty amazing things as time goes on, which I feel like is something that I see in a lot of our guests. It's like they've done really cool stuff. Their GitHub has a ton of projects, and your blog has all these posts, but it's just one at a time, just over time doing things in the right way. And as you keep going throughout your career and learning new things and sharing new things, you amass this pretty big database of knowledge and lessons to share.
Oh.
So if you're listening, now's a great time to get started on your blog. And you've been thinking about it. You can do it. You can even DM me, or I bet Deadly Dog would be interested in giving you some feedback or being a sounding board for ideas, little sanity check. Feel free to hit us up and get started. Well, 20 years developing. So I love talking to developers because it's always interesting to see where they found PowerShell and what they use it for and what about it interests them. Because I know there's a lot of great languages out there, and I'm sure PowerShell isn't your exclusive one, or you must have had experiences with other ones before. But where did you find PowerShell, and where did you start getting interested in it?
Yeah, so I first got introduced to PowerShell when I was looking to automate our build and deployment systems. Doing CI/CD, DevOps type of stuff. So this was back in like 2011, probably. I think the term DevOps was out there, but I hadn't heard of it. And so I just sort of became the DevOps guy at our office, which, I know that's wrong to say that people think DevOps just means CI/CD. It's actually much more. We'll maybe get into that later. But anyways, I got known as, the build and deployment guy for our flagship product. But yeah, so, we were deploying. It's a monolithic application written, C#, WPF, using WCF. But yeah, we're deploying it to virtual machines in our data centers. And so that's where we sort of found that we could leverage PowerShell. I guess I first got into it just building to make developers' lives easier. Everyone before used to just open up Visual Studio, hit F5 to build and run. But we found, the application's huge. It would take 10 minutes to build. And so we found a better way is I'm going to make some scripts that you can build. You don't actually have to open up Visual Studio. You can just double click this file. It'll build everything. So we wrote the whole build system out with PowerShell. But then getting into the deployments is really where PowerShell shined, where we had to deploy these applications to IIS. And it wasn't just one or two websites. It was deploying 20 different services to, maybe 50, 80 different virtual machines. And so, yeah, that's really when I got into PowerShell and fell in love with it.
Okay. That's an interesting time. So DevOps was a big movement. And how did that, I know PowerShell, you were doing deployments and CI/CD, and those things are kind of related. How did that all tie together? Because I know it probably wasn't just you hearing about DevOps. It was kind of an industry-wide sort of thing that was happening.
Yeah, it totally was. But again, I didn't know about it until years after we had sort of started down that road, the term DevOps, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we basically it wasn't anything that we necessarily heard about, even from the industry. It was just pain that we felt internally. And we're there has to be an easier way. I'm a developer. I automate things. Let me automate this, is really how it came about. So it came about very organically and naturally. We were using a build system. We were using TFS back then, Team Foundation Server, which has, gone through a few different names. Used to be Visual Studio Online. Now it's Azure DevOps. But it was very painful back then when we did it. You had to use Windows Workflow, which is a drag and drop visual editor. And using that to build your build and deployment system was very painful. And so, moving over to PowerShell, which is something where I can write code, I can test it, I can just run it on my local machine to test things out if I need. All these things was a much better, smoother process.
What elements of PowerShell did you like? Do you like the verbose nature? Did you like that it was, kind of meant for Microsoft services initially and kind of worked well with them? What elements kind of keep you coming back?
Yeah, for sure. I love how easy it is to read and write, because we did have some other scripts written in Ruby. And Ruby is very hard to, if you don't know the syntax of the language, if you've never seen it before, it's very hard to know what's going on, right? Whereas PowerShell, assuming you're not using aliases all over the place, you're using the full commandlet names, it's very easy to read, very easy to write. I was a C# developer and C++ before that, but so the whole .NET ecosystem I already knew, and you can leverage all of the .NET framework in PowerShell. I really loved that. So even if I didn't know what's the PowerShell way to do this, open a file and read it, I knew the C# way to do that, and I knew I could just call those same functions. And so it was just it was a very easy transition because of that, right? So
Nice. So you're sort of in the ecosystem already, and it's pretty decent shell and readable and all that other stuff. So kind of makes sense. But now you're still kind of playing in it so many years later. What type of stuff are you doing these days? I know you mentioned some platform engineering. Are you still in the pipeline world?
Yep. So for probably 3 or 4 years, I led a team of DevOps developers. We were actually called the pipeline specialists, where, so with DevOps, the whole DevOps movement, I guess we could get into it now. But with DevOps, it came about because developers used to write code, and then they would throw it over the wall for ops to go actually deploy it and run it in production, right?
Yep.
And then DevOps was saying, hey, let's get rid of that wall. And developers, you're now going to own your code all the way from, building the requirements, writing it, testing it, doing QA on it, and also deploying it, running it, monitoring it in production, right? And so now we had developers writing their own build and deployment pipelines, where before that, they would have just, emailed our SRE folks or our server admin folks being like, hey, here's a zip of the files. Can you go, copy paste these onto the servers to deploy the new version, right? Very manual, very slow, very painful, very error prone. You don't want to be doing that, right? And so when we said, we want to move over to this new DevOps model where teams are responsible for deploying their own software, running it, they're fully responsible for it. A lot of developers had never looked at, deploying something to a server before. It was a whole new paradigm that they had to learn. So, there's a whole lot of things that come with running your software. Now you need to be concerned with, how many servers is it running on? Maybe firewall rules. How do I actually get the code copied from, the build server onto those machines? And so PowerShell, that's where PowerShell really shines, is its ability to do remote sessions. So you can, copy all the files over. You can set up IIS, configure it, all with PowerShell, all really easily. And what I really love about it too is you can actually do all the commands on your local machine, on your local IIS, and then you can just, put that in a script block and then say invoke command and specify the server that you want to run the commands on, and it should run the exact same way on the servers, depending on, which operating system version you have and the version of IIS and things like that. But that's where it really shined for us is with the deployment system to all of our virtual machines.
So you're pretty deep into things now. I know you mentioned some Kubernetes earlier in your little thing you sent me. Yeah. How do you feel about the current tools that we have? I know you mentioned VS Code or GitHub Code workspaces or whatever, where you just press period. And I know VS Code's pretty sweet. PowerShell's awesome. How do you feel about it, though? Does it feel like things are in a good state, or does it feel kind of like always, where there's new tools being developed and they sort of work for now, but maybe they don't fully cover the whole problem and they introduce new ones? What's it like?
Yeah. So I can only give you my perspective. As you mentioned, and as I mentioned, I've been at the same company for 15 years just because they're an amazing, wonderful company. They've given me tons of opportunities. I get to work with new technologies. And, so I mentioned we deploy deploy web applications to IIS. We do that to on-prem servers. We also have VMs in Azure, but we also have, Azure native things. We're using app services, Azure functions, all that type of thing. We're using Kubernetes in Azure. And for that, we're using GitOps. So we just have a Git repository that sort of defines all of your Helm charts. And there's there's a bunch of things to Kubernetes. That in itself would be a whole talk to learn about. But so my experience is there's a whole bunch of tools for a whole bunch of different things. You might use them all at the same time, for different purposes. The tools, I do feel like they are getting better. GitOps wasn't a thing, 5-10 years ago. And I really like where that's moving. And Kubernetes in general is just really nice because, with Kubernetes, you get Docker. And before, you used to have to worry about, well, what type of application is this? Is it, a Python app, or is it a C# web app? Is it a Windows service? What is this thing, right? Docker sort of abstracts all that away, at least in terms of the deployment. So for deploying the thing, it's just always the same with a Docker container, right? So you say, I have this Docker container, you run docker.run or whatever the command is, and it'll just get it running in Kubernetes or There's Azure Container Services as well if you want to run it there. So I don't know if I would say that tools are converging. There's a lot of different players, and things are getting better. And it just sort of depends, I guess, who you go with, what you pick. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said about GitOps, though. I guess I sort of take it for granted how new of a thing that is. And GitOps is, I guess, basically just basing things around committing things to Git, right?
Yeah. So traditionally, you would commit stuff into your Git repository, and then some deployment pipeline kicks off, like GitHub Action or something like that. GitOps sort of reverses that dependency. So you have something watching the Git repository. And so when something in the Git repository changes, it says, hey, does what I have actually running in production match what's in the Git repository? No? Okay, let me go update the production environment to match what's in the Git repository. So.
And I think part of approving PRs and code, you can do all kinds of testing. And I know you have some experience with GitHub Actions in particular, which is what's on GitHub, which is kind of a cool way to start doing things like that and further automating and kind of, I think that it helps to be able to conceptualize the system that you're working with, to kind of think about it that, oh, it's just this Git repository here and everything kind of comes from that.
Yes. And everything's version controlled. If you mess something up, you just revert that commit and you're back to where you were, right? So
you've had a lot of different roles, and you kind of mentioned you were there before DevOps, and a lot of things have changed for you to be using Kubernetes and all these other technologies that you're currently using. How hard is it, or has it been a thing you've had to work on, how you can like view the whole system that you're working on, right? So you have code that's committed, you have actions that run, all these different steps of a process. I imagine with your experience now, you have a bit of a better grasp mentally, but is that something that's like developed over time? Because I can imagine someone newer to this would be maybe overwhelmed by thinking of like all the moving pieces, but how is it for you?
Yeah, it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And like, because where I am, like the company has been running since like 1999. So we have, and the flagship product is still from, back in the early 2000s, it's a monolith. And so like a monolith just means it's one big thing deployed all together at once, right? And so like conceptualizing that itself isn't too hard. But then, around 2010 or so, we started getting into microservices was the new buzzword, right? And so we also have a whole bunch of microservices all over the place. And each of those are built and deployed independently. They need to talk to each other. You might not always know, which ones depend on which other ones. So getting that dependency graph can definitely be a little troublesome. Like if you're a dev team, you might not even know all of the other internal services that rely on your team or what you might break if you deploy a change. There's tools out there that can, visualize that and find those dependency graphs and whatnot. But it's definitely hard. And especially for a newer developer, like you mentioned, to sort of hold all that in their mind at one time and conceptualize what that looks like, it's very hard. So I don't really have a good answer for you there. I think it comes with time. You need experience, and even it's experience with the business too, right? Because I could, we do microservices here. I could go to a different company that does microservices, and they might do it completely different. And the microservices they have are going to be completely different, right? And so even though I sort of know how everything works, it could still be a lot to take in and learn. You might still need months and months to really grasp it all.
Yeah, that's a good tip. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, be patient with yourself. Don't give up. If you have tools to visualize things, try and visualize it if you can, kind of make it make some form of sense. But I think that overwhelmed feeling is pretty common, and it's okay to kind of push through that and experience some of that. You learn a lot, I've found, in those times when you're like really confused but not giving up. Any advice you'd have for someone just getting started in that space?
I would say, like you said, be patient with yourself. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Because like I said, I've led a team before. I tell the guys, or I would tell them, my team, not guys, girls too, but I would tell them, I like you to try and struggle with a problem for a little bit, because when you struggle with a problem, that's oftentimes when you really learn, especially if you're able to figure it out. That's when you get that aha moment and things really click for you. But I don't want you to waste like 2 days on something that you could just ask someone about, right? So, depending on what the problem is, context is always important, but maybe spend an hour or two working with it yourself. Especially if it's something that's like an industry standard or a technology that you can just go Google and learn about and figure out yourself, right? If it's some internal tool or something like that that you know nothing about, you just go ask someone right away. That'll be much, much quicker. Don't waste your time. But yeah, so I would just say, don't be afraid to ask for help, but always do try and figure it out. That shouldn't be your first thing, is asking for help. You should try it and figure it out a little bit yourself first, and then go ask for help. So
Yeah, I think having a team that allows you to ask questions, but also, hires people who are curious enough and encourages them to kind of search them for themselves is a great environment to be in. I see you have some certs. You got your Azure certs going on. If someone's trying to get started, should they be doing projects? Should they follow the cert? Do you think it's I know Microsoft has put a lot of effort into their certs and making them relevant and helpful. What was your experience? Would you recommend it to someone trying to up their skills?
Yeah, for sure. The certificates, like the certificate itself, it might look good on your resume. It might help you get in the door. I'm not sure. It depends where you apply to. But it was the studying for the certificates and the going through the modules. I would say it could be tough if you haven't done anything with it before, depending on which level. If you're just doing the 100 or 101 level certificates, you could probably get by with just reading the Microsoft modules, learn modules that they have online. But some of the deeper ones, you're probably better off. You're going to need to have some experience with it. But what I found really helpful was it made me learn about a lot of the different technologies. Like my certificates are all with Azure. So it helped me learn about the different Azure technologies that I hadn't used yet. And just to be aware of them, what problems they solve, what they're for. And so when I encountered other issues at work where we have we have this problem, then now I have a few different tools in my tool belt that I can leverage. I'm like, oh yeah, and I know about this thing. I've heard about that, right? I know about whatever it is, Azure SQL databases or Event Hub, or, there's tons of different things. Azure has, 100 plus services. It's really hard to know them all, but just even having that sort of surface level knowledge that they exist and kind of what they do. So when you do run into a problem, you're like, I know there's something for this. Let me go research it further, right? And so that's what I found really helpful about doing those certificates. So I did the deep dive on the stuff that I knew really well, which was like Azure DevOps, CI/CD pipelines, GitHub Actions, that type of thing. But sort of like when you go to university, right, you choose your specialty, but there's also all these electives. And it's sort of learning about all the other stuff that's also in the ecosystem. I found that very, very valuable. So.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's always helpful when you can sort of start to paint the picture of everything that you're going to be dealing with. Even if it's not fully colored in, you have some sketch outlines you can go back to later if you encounter a problem or for further research. So interesting. That's a +1 to the certificates, because I think there was a pretty bad rap for a while with certs, but I think Microsoft has really put more effort into making them relevant, helpful, and sort of part of the plan for teaching people about Azure.
Yeah, I'll maybe say you're going to get out of it what you put in. So if you're just, you can buy practice exams, I think, online, and there's some free ones. And if that's all you're doing, you're not actually learning the content, you're just getting it to check a box, okay, whatever, right? But like I said, it was actually putting the time in to learn about things that I wouldn't have put the time in to learn it, right? And it has turned out to be really helpful and useful at my work. So for me, that's what it was all about.
Nice. It kind of gives you a curriculum to go through, and if you don't know where you want to go and learn, it gives you something to kind of focus on. But you definitely don't want to be forced into it, because I've had to do those certs before, and you don't get as much out of it. But again, with the whole, you have a bunch of different experience and different job titles: DevOps, SRE, platform engineer. What do these names mean? Do they mean anything? Is it just what companies choose to call the role, or is there actually a difference? What job title are we going to settle on here?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, I've worked at one company so far for my professional career, so I can't give you, I'll give you my opinion. Don't take it as the industry standard. So what DevOps means to me was, like I said, it was removing that barrier between the dev team and the operations team, and having the dev teams really own their systems, their services, their applications, all the way to production. not just saying, okay, here, operations team, go deploy this. You watch all the error logs, and if there's alerts, you guys, scale up the servers or whatever, right? It's having developers aware of how their application is running in production. Like, oh, CPU is running high. Maybe we should go fix that in our application, so that's not a problem, right? Whereas that wall before prevented a lot of that stuff. So to me, that's DevOps. It's the whole life cycle, a dev team owning their service, the whole thing. To me, SRE, site reliability engineering, that one means it's more infrastructure related, keeping the infrastructure healthy. And so it's still, watching application logs of, the applications that are running in production. And you might be getting paged. And it's for me, it's for dealing with, like I said, infrastructure concerns that the dev teams maybe wouldn't know how to deal with right away. So things like scaling out, if you need more instances, or scaling up, maybe you have virtual machines, you need to grow them from 4 gigs of memory to 8 gigs of memory, doing things like that. It's also having high availability and redundancy. So, deploying things to multiple regions, making sure it can fail over if one region goes down. So disaster recovery, doing things like taking backups. All that type of stuff. And, there is some manual work there sometimes, but, the job of SRE is to automate all that stuff. You should have, your early warning detection systems in there saying, this server is running high on CPU, maybe it's time to scale it out. And even developers could do those rules, especially in something like Azure, where, the Azure portal or using infrastructure as code, developers can configure a lot of those rules themselves, but there's some things where the SRE team it might make more sense for them to do things like networking issues, firewalls, things like that developers might not know about, or things that scale multiple applications, right? It's not owned by a single dev team. If I have an F5 load balancer in front of our data centers and there's an issue with that, that's not something I would expect a dev team to go deal with, right? Because they know nothing about it. So that's SRE. And platform engineering. So platform engineering is the new kid on the block. It's essentially, to me, platform engineering is deploying those applications easy for developers, giving them a system. So I sort of mentioned that when DevOps came about, now dev teams all had to learn how to build and deploy their systems to production. And every team has to learn that same lesson over and over. And a new team member joins the team. Oh, now they have to learn about the pipelines, and they have to learn about how the deployments work. And there's a lot of intricacies in there. There's a lot of details. There's a lot of things to overlook. Doing things like blue-green deployments so that you don't have any downtime. Doing things like canary releases, so you just release, or so you test out the application, maybe you have 1% or 5% of traffic going to the new version, and you see how it performs there before you update all of the instances to the new version. Things like that, right, that are easy to overlook. That's where I see the platform engineering coming into play, where they build out a platform that's easy for developers to use. And so the developers no longer have to sort of worry about, how do I do a blue-green deployment? How do I do a canary release, right? They just, say, hey system, here's my Docker container image. This is the version it should be using. Go make it happen. And that platform, the system that the platform engineering team has built out, takes it and deploys it to production in a safe way with zero downtime, right? And so, of course, where you work, you might not have all 3 groups. It really depends on how big your company is. And if you're like a smaller company, you might be the one person doing all 3 of those roles, right? So it really depends, but that's sort of my take on those three roles.
I guess this whole developing software thing is a pretty complex problem. Takes a few different roles, different titles, but we have to do what we have to do to deliver software and try and make it as easily as possible. Now, I want to hear about Summit, because you sent me a nice little Twitter message about how you got accepted to talk. So I want to hear about that process, because I think you said you did some talking at your company before, but never have done more of a big public sort of speech.
Yeah, so I'm super excited. Again, credit to your show, because it was you guys listening and promoting the PowerShell Summit is where I even heard about it. And, were encouraging the audience to go submit a talk. And I'm like, you know what? I will. And so I submitted 2 talks. Only one got accepted, but I'm super happy about that. So my talk is going to be on deploying your PowerShell modules using GitHub Actions. And it's a 45-minute session. I'm super psyched. I've given a lot of presentations at my office. I've done company-wide presentations, 300 plus employees on things like Azure Pipelines and Azure DevOps. So it's not totally foreign to me, but this is my first time doing, public speaking outside of my office or outside of my work. And so I do have a bit of anxiety about it. I'm not going to lie. But I'm just sort of forcing myself, even coming on this podcast. I've never done a podcast before, but I said, I wanted to start going outside of my comfort zone a little bit. That's how you learn. That's how you grow, right? And to see if this is something that I enjoy doing, because I really do like creating content. And I've wondered, do I want to be a content creator full time? I don't think I do, but maybe I'll enjoy giving presentations or putting on talks, that type of thing. And you don't know until you start trying it. And so this is just sort of me pushing myself to get outside my comfort zone a bit.
That's great to hear. And, we always learn a bit about ourselves throughout the whole journey. And I definitely can relate to being a little bit nervous, but, just put in the time and the effort and it'll all work out in the end. Very excited to hear that though. And I appreciate the honesty about the nerves, because that is definitely a part of it, is kind of dealing with that and getting through it and realizing, oh, it wasn't too bad. Maybe I could do it again. Or maybe it was really stressful and you choose not to. That's what I was like whenever I wrote a chapter in the PowerShell conference book. Writing isn't for me, probably, when it comes to books.
Yeah, there's just certain things, and now though, right? Now you tried it once, now that's not for me. And that's what I'm looking to get out of it. Because like I said, I do enjoy speaking, especially about things I'm passionate about, like PowerShell, automation, productivity, the tools, all that sort of stuff. I love that. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
No, you're good. I love those topics as well. PowerShell is what I love. But speaking about it can be a bit of a different thing. And it's cool that you found things that you have an area of expertise in and are willing to share with us. That is what it's all about. Talks is one way, blogs is another way, videos, whatever you got, it is always welcome in the PowerShell community. Awesome. Now, Dan, one quick little topic I wanted to cover was the work from home life, because I think a lot of us, and you were telling me earlier that you were one of these where things kind of changed. People went to full remote. Some companies tried doing back in office, some didn't. How has that been for you? How's that adjustment been?
Yeah, so it's been interesting for me. So for context, we were full in the office up until COVID hit. So that was, I guess 10, 11 years for me professionally. And then COVID hit and everyone was work from home. And, we're lucky enough to be in a position where we could work from home. A lot of different professions couldn't, right? But then after COVID sort of settled down and people were able to go back to the office, we have a really great company, and they trust employees and they really do look out for us. And they said, we understand not everyone's comfortable coming back to the office. And so they just wanted to take it slowly. And we were just doing back in the office 1 day a week. And so, you were encouraged to come. It was really nice getting to see everyone, especially after, 2-3 years. And so I personally do love working from home. You don't have to deal with the commute, especially in the winters, driving through the snow, all that type of stuff. I can just, get up and be ready for work in 5 minutes. So I like that aspect of it, but I definitely do miss some of the people aspect, just seeing those people, because there's a lot of people in the office that you don't talk to anymore. So you don't randomly bump into them in the hallway or by the water cooler or getting a coffee anymore, right? In our office especially, we would do things like we would go play soccer together in the parks 1 or 2 days a week over lunchtime. And so I miss, just hanging out, building those relationships with the coworkers. So I'm lucky enough that I was an employee there for a long time. I had a lot of those relationships already. But for people who just started around COVID, I imagine it's a much different working environment, or it feels like a different workplace than what I have, right? Because they haven't gotten to have all of those in-person connections and build them the same way that people pre-COVID got to. So,
Yeah. Where I work, we do a thing where and it's actually the week that this episode goes out. So I will be in Salt Lake City with the whole company, forming those kind of in-person connections that are honestly so helpful for collaboration and for just sharing knowledge and working together. It's very helpful to have some form of personal connection outside of just seeing their name on Slack or Teams or what have you. So definitely looking forward to those. That's part of why, and I'm curious to see what you say after experiencing Summit. But Summit is another one of those events that just really charges you up, and kind of for my meter of like my people meter, it fills me up for a couple months of like, hey, I know I belong. These are my people. I can contribute more and do things like that.
Yeah, but then you definitely need downtime after. I can definitely relate to that. I think a lot of us are introverts, but like I love being around people, but yeah, I can't do it for a long period of time. Yeah. I think one last thing I'll say just on the work from home is I think like I said, I really do enjoy it. I really loved it. I think it's going to be a lot harder for any new developers or IT or people coming into the profession, just because there's so much you learn just by watching over somebody's shoulder, right? And just having those informal conversations. So even just, someone in PowerShell, they might use a keyboard shortcut. You go, hey, what was that? How did you do that? Right? You don't get to see a lot of that stuff, even if you're pair programming virtually. Just a lot of that stuff gets lost, right? And you have to make the conscious effort to pair program virtually, which is really tough to do. So I'll maybe mention one thing my team did do, the pipeline specialist team. Back when COVID did hit, there was 5 of us, and we would just have a Zoom call open all day long that we were on, but we would have the cameras turned off, the microphones turned off or muted. You're not obligated to be at your desk, but if you had a question, you could just unmute and go like, hey, Kyle, what do you think about this? Or, hey, can you take a look at this? And if they're not there, that's totally fine. But then a lot of the times other people would hear that too, because the whole team might be on the call and be like, oh, I encountered that last week. This is how I dealt with it. Or, just random conversations start up, not even work-related stuff. And so it did help build camaraderie even over the virtual setting. So,
yep. I had a similar experience with my previous team where we would do that. We would just join Discord. Occasionally people would collaborate on a problem, and usually I would just kind of half listen and just sort of reminded me of the office again. And, sometimes you learn little things, you maybe mention something that leads to something helpful. It's definitely nice. It opens up an avenue for small talk.
Yeah, I know not everyone's comfortable with that, right? Lots of people don't want to be on a call all day, and that's totally understandable. So it worked for us. I just thought I would mention it. It might work for your team, maybe not. So
yeah, even just maybe an hour a day. There's like, hey, it's open office hours. If anybody wants to come by and hang out, we can work, we can not work, whatever works for your environment. Awesome. Well, Dan, we're coming up at the end here, and I like to end with some questions. And you know what? I sent you a list of 3 common parameters. And I did that in the episode with Mike Kanekos, and I was called out. Apparently, at some point in time last year, I said this year I was going to do some uncommon parameters and switch up the questions. So you came prepared for some questions, and I'm going to last minute completely change them on you.
Oh, no.
I don't know what I'm going to say. I could say anything. I could ask anything. Maybe I'll give you a little amendment to what we said earlier and just kind of give you a different take on these questions. So we'll start off with this one. I just want to ask the same ones as before. What's your number 1 module other than the tips module that you would recommend to somebody? Just one. I know it's way harder than 3.
I'm conflicted here because, like I said, I've listened to this show forever, and I know the modules that have been mentioned a bunch. And I want to mention those, but that doesn't really give the viewers or the audience anything new, right?
Go zany.
Yeah. I'm going to mention all 3. I don't care about your question. So
fair.
I'd say like one of the best ones that I would say is Profiler. I heard about it on the show. I used that to profile my tips module. It was super helpful because the tips is maybe unique in that I wanted to add it to the user profile, so it starts up every time. And when I initially wrote it, it was like 4 seconds to start up, and nobody wants to have be waiting 4 seconds for your terminal to actually let you be able to type in it every time you open it, right? And so I ran Profiler, though. It showed me where the problem was, and I got it down to like 100 milliseconds, something like that. So it was super useful. And I'm just going to say them because I've been prepping.
I know. I shouldn't have done that to you, man. That's my bad.
I've been thinking about these. Another one that I'm pretty positive no one has ever mentioned, because maybe it's not a real module, it's not on the gallery, but is the web administration module. So the web administration module is used for configuring IIS on servers, and it's a Windows Server feature. So typically you go into the Windows Server options and install it from there. I'm not sure if it's available on the gallery, but no one's mentioned that one, so I thought I would. And then another all-time favorite is import Excel. Just that's awesome. Whenever you have a bunch of data dumped to a table that you want to share with other people, it's, just export it to Excel, send it to your manager, send it to your coworkers, whoever, right? And just then they have the data in a nice, easy format. They can filter it and do whatever they want with it, right? So import Excel is awesome.
What is your favorite part of AI? Like favorite thing it might help you do, or you look forward to in the future, or you're concerned with? I guess favorite or least favorite?
Sure. So I haven't played a whole bunch with the AI APIs. Like I know there's, there's the PowerShell module for
PowerShell AI.
PowerShell AI. Thank you.
Yeah.
I haven't played around with that yet, but what I have used is Copilot in Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio, and so that is 100% worth the price, in my opinion. It makes you much more productive as a developer writing code. Not even as a developer, me writing blog posts. I write them in Markdown in Visual Studio Code, and writing my tips for the PowerShell tips module. It'll often just auto-complete your sentences for you. If you go to type up like some example code, it knows what you want to write. It just fills it all in. Of course, you can't rely on it 100%. You still need to look over what it wrote, correct some things. But lots of times it'll like word things better than I was thinking of wording them for my blog post or for a tip, right? And you do have to be careful too. It generates URLs that a lot of the time aren't real. They don't actually work. So you got to be careful there as well. But yeah.
Okay, that's good. Did you see the new feature for quick rename using GitHub Copilot in Visual Studio? It's like a way to suggest different names for your classes and things like that to kind of make it more uniform, or just like a little pop-up you can click.
I saw the tweets about it before. Is it released now? Because I saw the tweets about it that it was coming, and then that was the last I heard about it.
I just saw a blog post. I don't have it up right now, but maybe by the time this is live, it'll actually be up.
I know another interesting one is the committing in VS Code, where it'll suggest your commit message for you. Yeah, so that one looks interesting as well. Yeah.
What is the number one tip you would give to someone just starting out in PowerShell, no developer background?
Ooh, that's tough, because my other talk I submitted to Summit that did not get accepted was PowerShell for the C# developer. So I would have been, I would have had stuff ready for that question.
Well, let's pivot to that. Developers who are wanting to take better advantage of PowerShell.
Well, we've already talked about it a little bit, right? Like if you come from the .NET background, you can utilize .NET in your PowerShell, which is super fantastic. So if you're stuck, just fall back to what you already know. But I want to go back to your original question. So for a non-developer coming into using PowerShell is like, I'd probably say just read the online help modules, or like don't be afraid to go look at the help. The online help is awesome. Microsoft has done a really good job, and if you find, if you find a commandlet that you're not sure what the parameters are or whatnot, just do a quick Google for it. There's going to be a help page for it. You can do get help in the console. I personally like going to the web page just because that's me. It's always up-to-date information. If you find something's wrong or missing there, it's all open source on GitHub. You can open a pull request to update the docs, right? That type of thing. But just like learning any language, though, I would probably say find a few tutorials and go through them, because it's hard to know what you don't know. Like you don't know what you don't know, right? So you don't know to Google for it. You don't know that this command exists. And so that's when just going through some tutorials for learning PowerShell. I don't have any particularly in mind that I could call out, but
lots of blogs out there. Douse.dev has a weekly listing of a whole bunch of great blogs and projects that are often a good starting place. But I think that finding out the resources that are going to work well for you on your journey, get started at learn.microsoft. Maybe you're a book person. Maybe you find a blogger who you really vibe with and you love what they write and you kind of follow their journey and start to implement some of it. Whatever the case may be, just kind of find what works for you and don't give up, just one step at a time. Especially if you're new completely, things can feel a little overwhelming if you're looking and copying, pasting online code that uses the pipeline and connects all these commands and has weird variable names. But it'll all make sense one day if you stick with it.
And yeah, you mentioned books. I didn't even think, but PowerShell in a Month of Lunches, that's like a very commonly recommended. Yes.
Yep. That is a great book. Definitely helped me in my journey. Yeah, there's a new edition as well. So exciting stuff. Now, Dan, thank you for answering those questions. I know I put you on the spot. I know you said you were nervous for the podcast, and then I did that to you. So definitely I'm not the nicest guy. But you know what? When it comes to shilling, I'm really quite thrilling. So if you're listening to this, please leave us a like, comment, and subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review and say something nice. That'd be great. You can send feedback to PowerShell@pdq.com and I will read it. And if you suggest and plug your own module, I'll plug it on the podcast. Happy to do that. I should have said that earlier so we could have been highlighting this tips module months ago, but here we are. Don't forget to check out the tips module. And if you want to join the inner circle, did you know we have a PowerShell scripting channel in the PDQ Discord? You can find me there every day. Discord.gg/PDQ if you want to find us there. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. It is such a pleasure getting to speak with you and meet you for the first time. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you maybe at Summit, maybe shortly after, and tap in with you again and see how the whole process was for you. If this is your first time hearing about Dan, reach out to him, follow him online. He has a lot of great insights and he is an appreciated member of this community. Dan, people like you, where can they find you on this internet?
Yes, awesome. Thank you. You can find me on Twitter or X. It's just @DeadlyDog. I'm also on Mastodon at hachyderm.io/DeadlyDog. Or the best place is just actually go to my blog, blog.danskingdom.com. It has all of my socials, my email, everything is on there as well. Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. This has been very surreal. Like I said, I've listened to every single episode, and so it's like a mini dream come true, I'll say,
awesome.
to be on here with you.
Well, next time we speak, I'm going to ask you where you came up with the name Deadly Dog. Don't tell me now. I'm still very curious. I didn't get to ask it. Next time we chat, I will find out the origins of that online moniker. Dan, great meeting you. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a safe ride if you're driving. Enjoy your workday if you're working. Enjoy your weekend if you're on the weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.